The oppression of the people by the king and his plundering of temples is something which Kalhan regards with great horror. This was an old practice, the kings, they used to plunder the temples of the vanquished rulers. An oppressive king, this is what Kalhan is referring to. An oppressive king is not to be tolerated, and this is the advice of the Shastras. Shankar Varman's oppressive acts are listed at length, from plundering temples to the resumption of grants and the extraction of forced labor. One of the reasons why Harsha lost power was because according to Kallan, because he plundered the temples and even went to the extent of appointing a Devo Patanya Nayaka, an officer for the uprooting of the divine images. The Shastric injunction is that the king's primary duty is to protect his people and attend to their welfare. An oppressive king therefore deserves misfortune which surround him. The latter part of the historic account in the Chronicle shows an unusually modern understanding of what goes into the making of historical processes, and that is very important. This has led to Kalhana's writing being regarded as quite distinct from other historical works in Sanskrit tradition. Why? Because histories of other regions were written at this time, and historical biography became a frequent form of literary expression from the post-Gupta period onwards. Vanshalis and genealogical accounts of the various dynasties became increasingly frequent, and many of these have yet to be worked on by a modern scholar. From the material available, it is clear that in this category of literature, the Rajtarangani holds a position of preeminence. Then the question arises as to why medieval Kashmir gave rise to such a historical writing. Why at all? A number of reasons have already been suggested. The geographical isolation of Kashmir, the valley surrounded by high mountains, encircled by mountains, led to a stronger sense of nationalism amongst them people, unity amongst them people. The persistence of Buddhism in Kashmir, with its more definite sense of history than Brahmanism, could have been another factor. Kashmir also came under the influence of the number of non-Indian cultures such as Greek, the Chinese and possibly the Turkish, all of which again had definite historical traditions which might have influenced them. The geographical isolation of Kashmir was certainly a positive factor. Yet Kashmir was not totally isolated. The material remains of the culture of Kashmir shows close contacts with Gandhara, Northern India, Central Asia and even China. To the fact of geographical isolation should be added the corollary that the period when Kalhana wrote was one of intense regional loyalties throughout the northern India. There was ample patronage available in the proliferating courts of the small kingdoms. Inevitably, there was concern with local cultures, local problems, local events, local deities, etc. Each kingdom saw itself as a great kingdom in exaggerated terms, but in fact, the area of reference was a parochial one. This had the advantage that it permitted the thinkers of the time to concentrate on a small canvas and work on it more intensively. The Damaras were the concern of the kings of Kashmir and not the rest of the India. We don't find references to Damaras in the contemporary literature in any part of India. Kalhan was content to leave it at that. The impact of Buddhism was probably a subconscious impact of on Kalhan. The text makes it clear that he was no supporter of Buddhist religion, but instead regarded it with great suspicion. But he must have had to consult many Buddhist texts on certain sections of history of Kashmir. It is evident he refers to them in his book. The recording of some of these traditions in Kashmir itself, like monastic centers, must also have contributed to creating a more real sense of the past. Similarly, the influence on the Greek, the Chinese and the Islamic knowledge of Islamic as available of the Central Asian Turks who had, great, interactions with them, intercourse with them. Historical tradition need not have come through a direct knowledge of Greek, Chinese or Turkish historical writing, but rather through a familiarity with the cultural ethos which produced writing both as something of the past, the Greeks, and something contemporary, the Chinese and the Turkish. Kalhana nowhere indicates familiarity with any of these languages or their literatures. So, the influence must have come about through a process of cultural osmosis. Credit must also be given to the man himself. Why only to the surroundings and other contexts and other factors? Writing as he was at a particular time in history, none of the earlier accounts of Kashmir which Kalhan used as sources which we have enumerated, nor for that matter the post-Kalhana chronicles show evidence of the same historical understanding as does the Raitarangini. The later historians and chronicles such as Jona Raja, Shrivara, Prajanya Bhatta and Shuka, who were subject to the same influences, do not reveal the same grasp of historical processes. Kalhana was obviously a man with an analytical mind, which the latter writers were not. To that extent, he was writing the history of a state which at that time was passing through the moments of decline, which in itself must have given rise to considerable introspection and questioning in the minds of sensitive and thoughtful persons like Kalhan. Kalhan himself belonged to a ministerial family, a bureaucratic family, which had once held power but had gradually lost it. He was thus familiar with the forces which go to the making of politics and history, but was not a part of them. He could look upon the situation with the perspective of an outsider from distance, but at the same time retaining the insights of one who is part of that situation. Having once decided not to write a sycophant's history, he could afford to probe impersonally into many of the existing conditions. He makes it very clear that I am not writing a panegyric. Finally, perhaps the greatest advantage that regions such as Kashmir derive from being opened up to Buddhist, Greek, Chinese, Turkish, multiple influences was that in the Indian tradition, these were non-orthodox foreign influences and could therefore nurture non-orthodox thinking. This is not to suggest that Kalhana wrote his history because he was a non-conformist. He was not. As we have seen, there are many aspects of his writing which, adhere closely to orthodox thinking on the subject. It is rather to suggest that Kalhan was not a man with a closed mind, and this, after all, is an essential qualification for a good historian. If you remember, I had told you Ignaz Goldziar's, famous sentence that when I do history, I shut my religion out. So, this is what he is doing. He is shutting everything out. That is the essential qualification of historian. The question that naturally arises now is, why did historiography not develop in ancient India? It could be one of the speculative answer. One explanation has been that in India, mythology was very strong. This is very simple and very, plebeian kind of explanation. But then, this was the case elsewhere also, where history did develop. Keith, in History of Sanskrit Literature, explains it in terms of Indians' belief in the transmigration of soul. That's why they are not bothered about history. So, this again appears to be a very, very unacceptable explanation. Why? Because perhaps the whole urge to seek explanation is futile and adds a wrong perspective to the problem. If we move from this angle, history did not develop in almost all civilizations. We have surveyed most of them, except China or those influenced by the Greeks directly. There was no historiography worth the name in Egypt. There was no historiography worth the name in Mesopotamia, ancient Persia, etc. So it is not the Indian case that is unique or exceptional. I want to, hammer this point out, but the case of those countries which did not develop it, China and Greece. To be expecting independent development of history in India would perhaps be asking too much. So the question, the question remains, what was the advantage with Kalan had and others did not have? What is the, in other words, the uniqueness of Kalan? There were sources, no doubt, and he is, dealing with them with great amount of, caution. He is not believing and he is not attesting to the, supernatural factors as to be responsible for historical acts. Now, so far the sources are concerned, in his case, we have already narrated what are his major sources. Most of them are not available now, but he is frequently referring to Puranas. Now, let us see what kind of Puranas and how far the Puranas can help us in constructing our history. Are they really very important? Or can we dispense with them in writing history? So, I will deal with that. As said earlier, historical elements as against historiography were indeed present all through in ancient India, and they can be seen in, especially in Puranas and Sangam literature. Here I would concentrate on these two. The Puranas. Purana is an adjective which means old, ancient, but already in Atharvaved, which is datable to 800 BC, the word is used, Purana word is used for ancient lore. Within quote, I am saying ancient lore, not history. Of course, would mean the story of the past as narrated according to popular or priest beliefs. So, would include an extending mass of mythology. What was known as Puranas conventionally held to be 18 in number are texts that contain much detail about Brahmana ritual, along with the statements about what has happened in our present evil age, that is Kali Yuga, when the Puranas were composed, which began after the Bharata war, Mahabharata. These texts have continued to be embellished, altered, added to, and expanded down the ages so that the same Purana could exist in many versions. The scholars have diligently distinguished and expand the earlier texts mainly by the device of picking those versions of whose Kali Yuga annals end at the earliest point. I mean, I am referring to the famous scholar F.E. Pargeter. As early as 1913, he published an annotated edition and translation of such early versions. Though even in these, the language, the forms of names, orders of sequence of rulers, etc. vary considerably. The texts edited by Pargeter, despite the discovery of other manuscripts and versions, seem still to be the best representatives of the earlier stratum of this body of quasi-historical literature. The Puranas in their annals consist mainly of the rulers' names with the numbers of years to which their reigns extended. The form taken is that of the prediction made by Suta or by Prashara at the beginning of the Kali age as to what is going to happen in future. Thus, this is in future sense. Thus, the past, that is Purana, is presented as the future, that is Bhavishya. And there is actually Bhavishya Purana, now with much alloyed text, which a set of other early Puranas acknowledge to be the source they draw on. Since the skeletal dynastic accounts, very limited information, omit any account of the Gupta dynasty except for a bare passing reference, it is believed that the early Purana texts were composed around the beginning of the 4th century AD. Otherwise, how could they, miss Guptas? The metrical portions and many names notably in the annals of the dynasties from time of the Gautama Buddha onwards, suggests that their sources lay in earlier compilations of Prakrit ballads, popular enumerations of rulers, which were then put into Sanskrit. In other words, while the source of the pre-Buddha dynasties was probably a construction of Brahminical tradition, the annals of the Shishunag dynasty of Magad and subsequent dynasties had possibly more Prakrit sources. It is likely that in these Puranic annals, the historical portion begins only with Shishunag dynasty. From here onwards, we are able to verify parts, at least of the Puranic lists, from the other sources. For example, Bimbisar, that is Bimbisar or Rajashatru of Shishunag dynasty appear in Buddhist annals of the life of Gautama Buddha. Of the Mauryas, the Puranic annals of at least the first three rulers similarly accord with Buddhist annals. Otherwise also, with what Greek accounts and Ashoka's inscriptions tell us, while therefore caution is to be exercised in making use of Puranic dynastic lists, their order of sequence, reign of periods, reigns, even names of individual rulers may not be in many cases reliable or accurate, because these still constitute a valuable source for us, the Puranas. As in the case of Mauryan times, these can be verified on certain points by reference to inscriptions. We start finding Ashokan inscriptions, and this again shows that their evidence is not to be summarily dismissed. They have some use value. It may be, I am using economics, history, vocabulary, use value it has some. It may be seen from our present chapter, present talk I mean, that in view of the scantiness of information to be gained from inscriptions and coins for the indigenous dynasties from circa 200 BC to 100 AD, the Puranas alone offer, in the case of at least three dynasties, the Shungas, the Kanvayanas and the Andhras, a possible framework of a dynastic history, which may then be verified or modified by reference to other evidence, mainly the inscriptional evidences. Obviously, they are not proclaimed historical texts, and rightly so, but claim to be divine predictions. They themselves claim that they are divine predictions. So, in these predictions, besides mythological dynasties, are also described certain existing dynasties. By and large, they begin from the Gupta period, not before that. Not only are they historically very unreliable, but are very restrictive in approach, confined to as mere genealogies of rulers. This is, this is what I wanted to share with you, the riders which we should apply when we are using Puranas as a source. This gentleman, Kalhan was doing that. So, these are our, points where, you should be very careful. And from that, in my lecture on Kalhan, I had told you that how reliable he considers Puranas to be. Very often he disagrees with them. So, the other source of information, especially for our South Indian part, is the Sangam text. Sangam texts, Shangam text. The Sangam, also is spelled as Chankam, text form the earliest body of Tamil literature. The term Sangam means an assemblage or academy. Sangam, it is close to Sangam, where literary compositions, especially poems, were recited and judged. Traditions speak of these, three such successive Shangams, which extended in all to over 9,900 years, 90 years. Both historical and literary criticism has led to the view that Shangam poems were composed and circulated in an early period to be much later put into anthologies. These anthologies are 8 in number, called Togai or Etut Togai, and coexist with 10 long poems grouped in a set called Pattu or Pattu Pattu. These had assumed their present form by the 14th century, thus contain composition spread over a long period, because they are coming finally in the shape in 14th century. The earlier portion, to which historians now apply the designation of Sangam, has been reduced to over 2000 poems, found in 6 anthologies and a collection of longer poems. In themes, these poems range from those of address to gods and of exploits of war to elegies of the rulers, the strong influence of Brahminical rituals and divinities, an infusion of Prakrit and Sanskrit vocabulary that suggests a post-Mauryan date for even the earliest of the Sangam compositions. Otherwise, how come Ashokan Prakrit is reflected there? From reference to Yavanas, now Yavans means Yunans, that is Greeks, coming on their vessels to carry on the trade, it has been deduced that they belong to the period of the flourishing Roman trade of the early centuries AD. Similarly, from the late tradition attesting to the Chera ruler of Shenguttavan, mentioned in the Sangam's text as ruling contemporaneously with the Sri Lankan ruler Gajabahu, datable from Singhali's chronicle Mahavamsha to the late 2nd century AD, which is an important chronological synchronism, has been inferred, enabling Shenguttavan to be placed in the 2nd century AD. On the basis of such evidence, Sangam compositions have been held to belong to the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, not beyond that or before that. Sangam literature constitutes an undoubtedly rich source of history of Tamil Nadu. In respect of beliefs, social customs, rituals, its importance is manifest, it's very evident. For political history too, in view of the meager information to be derived from Tamil Brahmi inscriptions, the poems have been sought to be used as a massive query. The excessive exaggeration, inflated eulogies and claims of impossible achievements credited to the poet's heroes must, however, all be heavily discounted in order to, pick up some of the historical elements from this vast Sangam literature. Before the contours of even dynasties and their conflicts can be worked out, or the nature of polities of the time which we discern with any amount of clarity. Nonetheless, the residue that remains of Sangam literature is still of great value to the historian. Therefore, Sangam literature is also a very good source of information for our ancient Indian, especially for ancient Indian, South Peninsular Indian history. I will speak about Buddhist Jain traditions because in the entire discourse we were dealing with Buddhist and Jain traditions. Buddhist texts, especially the Ashokan inscriptions, Milinda Pannu, Mahavamsha, it's a Sri Lankan text. They contain Buddhist traditions about Buddha and later benefactors of Buddhism, including Ashok. It has a lot of unreliable and legendary material. They have to be sequestered. They had to be separated. By this time, much of Buddha's life was narrated along legendary lines, Jaina texts like Tirthankaras are even more legendary and stereotyped than the Buddhist texts. That is Kavya. How far they are a reliable source of information. These are mostly panegyrics of the poet's patron, treating him a perfect hero. Perhaps the best known for historians is Samudgupta's inscription of Ashoka's pillar at Allahabad, written by Hari Sen. Look at the kind of praise he is showering on the king. This kind of panegyric implied, however, awareness of certain historical facts, at least the real existence of the patron, that is established, the existence of the places claimed by the poet to have been conquered by the patron, even if they had not been conquered. Some of the described achievements would indeed be true, but the mingling of exaggeration with factual occurrences is such as to make any shifting, highly impossible. Nigh impossible, I would say. So, Harshacharita, this is also cited as a source of history written by Banabhatta around 640 AD. This is a semi-historical work about the ruler of Thaneshwar and Kannauj. Some people, they say that in India, we did not have the tradition of biography writing. We have this, and when we dealt with Kalhan, we have seen that he is consulting biographies. So, this was written during the first half of the 7th century. Ban, unlike other poets, does not quite exaggerate. That is the uniqueness of him, especially historical events. But in his large compilation, the total amount of historical information would barely be just a few pages. And one passage I remember, when he is dealing with, Harsha has won some war and he is entering into the city, then there is a passage, very difficult Sanskrit prose, but even, P.V. Kane found it very difficult to translate. But I, with the help of my teacher, Professor S.R. Sharma, renowned professor of Sanskrit literature, we tried to translate that, and then we found that at least there, there are certain passages where he is speaking about common people and their crafts. For example, Bahuvid Bhakti Nipun Nirman, he is saying about the ladies that, they are very skilled in making paintings on the cloths. Similar information, there are plenty of them. So, similarly, he is talking about the, the Norya, that the Norya, ungeared Sakya. He is saying that there are wells where, the wells where the machine is put, and with that water lift, the water is drawn from the bottom of the well. Now, this refers to that there is a development from Norya proper, where the vessels were tied to the, like this, they were tied to the rim of the spokes. They are now separated. Now, they are coming down like this to the, to touch the water at the deep level of the. So, these kind of information you find, there are very interesting information, and they are historical, not, of course, so far other things are concerned, I am not dealing with that. So, therefore, obviously, history is not his concern. The motive of his work is to create work of literature, but wherever historical events are narrated, Bana refrains from exaggeration and hyperbole and appears remarkably simple in his prose. Some of the important historical information provided him can be verified from, his contemporary Chinese traveler Yuan Chuang's account. His style is highly ornamental and archaic. There is an excessive use of unfamiliar words. Sentences are sometimes drafted in a manner as to carry double meanings, as I referred to you just now. Because Bana's work was Praschit at its apex, it had many imitators. Bilhan wrote a similar, though not so good, panegyric on Chalukya ruler Vikramaditya. Dynastic annals are again another source of information. None of these annals have survived, but their existence can be assumed because they are referred to in inscriptions of the Gupta period and onwards. Kalhan also, records that previous to his time, dynastic annals were written. If you remember how, this annals has started, helping us in writing history of the, Greek world, Egyptian world, and Syrian world, and the Arab world. The summaries of which he claimed to have access to, in some cases, he says he could utilize fragmentary annals. The Arab accounts of the conquest of Sindh have portions which deal with earlier dynasties, information on which they acquired from Brahmins with whom they interacted, who had access to these annals. So, these are indirect sources which refer to annals, but none of these annals unfortunately have survived to the best of our knowledge till date. They might come up sometime, I don't know. The lack of any historical sense among the Indians, they perhaps led to their disappearance. One should be very cautious about it.